The morning sun cast long shadows across the twin peaks of Hattin, their jagged silhouettes resembling the horns of some primordial beast awakening from eternal slumber. Sir Edmund de Montfort wiped the sweat from his brow as he gazed across the parched landscape of the Holy Land, his blue eyes reflecting the weight of impending doom. The year was 1180, and the Christian kingdom of Jerusalem stood on the precipice of its greatest trial. The dust clouds rising from the east told a story that every seasoned warrior could read like scripture. Saladin, the Sultan of Egypt and Syria, had come with his vast army, their banners streaming in the desert wind like harbingers of judgment. Edmund's calloused hand instinctively moved to the pommel of his sword, the worn leather grip familiar beneath his fingers after 2 decades of service in the Holy Land. "The numbers are against us," muttered Sir Reginald de Vere, his voice barely audible above the restless stamping of horses and the nervous murmur of men. The veteran knight's scarred face bore the marks of countless battles, each line a testament to his survival in this unforgiving land. 20,000 of them, perhaps more. Edmund nodded grimly. King Guy de Lusignan had assembled nearly every able-bodied knight in the kingdom, stripping castles and fortresses of their defenders in a desperate gamble. The true cross, that most sacred of relics, had been brought from Jerusalem to inspire the faithful, its golden frame gleaming in the morning light. Yet even with God's blessing, the odds seemed insurmountable. The army stretched across the arid plain like a river of steel and flesh. Knights in their heavy mail hauberks sat astride the striders, their colorful surcoats bearing the heraldry of noble houses from across Christendom. The Templars, those warrior monks bound by sacred vows, formed disciplined ranks near the center, their white mantles marked with the red cross of their order. Beside them, the Hospitallers maintained their own formation, their black robes a stark contrast to their brothers' white. Common soldiers, sergeants, and crossbowmen filled the spaces between, their faces showing the same mixture of determination and fear that had marked crusaders for nearly a century. As recorded in the contemporary chronicle of the Archbishop of Tyre, the kingdom's forces had been systematically weakened by years of internal strife and poor leadership. The heat was already oppressive, though the sun had barely reached its zenith. Edmund felt the weight of his mail pressing against his shoulders, the steel already growing warm to the touch. Water was precious here, more valuable than gold, and their supplies would not last long under the merciless Palestinian sun. "Look there." Reginald pointed toward the Muslim lines, where the distinctive yellow banners of Saladin's personal guard could be seen. "The Sultan himself leads them. They say he's sworn to reclaim Jerusalem for Islam, to wash away the stain of our conquest." Edmund's jaw tightened. He had been barely 7 years old when Jerusalem fell to the First Crusade, but he had grown up on stories of that glorious victory. Godfrey of Bouillon, Raymond of Toulouse, Tancred of Headville, names that had become legends. Now 3 generations later, their legacy hung in the balance on this scorching battlefield. The air shimmered with heat, creating mirages that danced across the horizon like phantom armies. Vultures circled overhead, their harsh cries adding an ominous note to the symphony of preparation. Horses snorted and pawed the ground, sensing their riders' tension. Squires hurried between the ranks, checking armor straps and weapon bindings, their young faces grave with responsibility. "Whatever happens today," Edmund said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of a lifetime's service, "we fight not just for the kingdom, but for the very soul of Christendom. These lands have been sanctified by the blood of martyrs and the footsteps of Christ himself." The trumpets began to sound, their brassy notes cutting through the morning air like the call of judgment itself. King Guy's banner, the golden crosses of Jerusalem on a field of silver, rose higher as the royal standard-bearer prepared to lead the advance. The moment of truth had arrived. The warriors of the shattered realm would soon learn whether their oaths were stronger than their enemies' blades, whether their faith could withstand the fire of battle. Edmund de Montfort closed his eyes briefly, whispering a prayer to St. Michael, patron of warriors, then spurred his destrier forward. The Battle of Hattin was about to begin, and with it, the fate of the Holy Land would be decided. The Twin Peaks watched silently as 20,000 souls prepared to write their names in blood across the pages of history. The sun climbed higher, transforming the battlefield into a furnace of steel and suffering. Sir Edmund de Montfort found himself caught in the maelstrom of combat, his sword singing through the air as he parried a curved scimitar that gleamed like quicksilver in the harsh light. The Muslim warrior before him moved with the fluid grace of the desert, his dark eyes burning with the fervor of jihad. "Allahu Akbar," the Saracen cried, his blade weaving patterns of death that Edmund barely deflected. The Christian knight's heavy armor, designed for the cooler climates of Europe, had become an iron prison under the Palestinian sun. Sweat poured down his face, stinging his eyes and making his grip slippery on his sword's leather-wrapped handle. Around them, the battle raged with primal fury. The ordered ranks of the morning had dissolved into chaos as Saladin's forces pressed their attack from all sides. The famous Mamluk cavalry, slave soldiers trained from childhood in the arts of war, struck like lightning and withdrew before the heavy Christian knights could respond. Their composite bows sent clouds of arrows arcing through the air, each shaft seeking gaps in mail and Sir Reginald de Vere appeared through the melee, his shield arm hanging useless at his side, blood seeping through the links of his hauberk. He shouted over the din of battle. "They're falling back to the hill." Edmund's heart sank. The military orders had been the backbone of the kingdom's defense for generations. If they were retreating, the situation was far worse than he had imagined. Through the dust and smoke, he could see the black banners of the Hospitallers, indeed withdrawing toward the higher ground, their disciplined formation crumbling under the relentless pressure of Saladin's assault. The true cross, that sacred symbol of Christian victory, still gleamed in the center of the battlefield. But the ring of defenders around it grew thinner with each passing moment. Archbishop Heraclius, resplendent in his ceremonial robes, held the relic high above his head, his voice raised in desperate prayer. Yet even God's most sacred artifacts seemed powerless against the tide of Muslim steel. A horn sounded from the east, not the familiar notes of Christian trumpets, but the haunting call of a Saracen war horn. Fresh troops poured over the ridge, their green banners marking them as men of Damascus. Saladin, the great sultan whose very name had become synonymous with Muslim resurgence, was committing his reserves. The trap was closing. Edmund's destrier stumbled, an arrow protruding from its neck. The noble animal went down in a tangle of legs and leather, throwing its rider to the rocky ground. The knight rolled away just as a Mamluk horseman's sword cleaved the air where his head had been. Rising to his feet, Edmund found himself part of a desperate circle of defenders, their shields locked together in the ancient formation their ancestors had used against Viking raiders. Watergast, a young sergeant, his face paled beneath his iron cap. For the love of Mary, water. There was none to give. The army's water supplies, already inadequate for the desert crossing, had been contaminated or lost in the chaos of battle. Men were beginning to collapse from heat exhaustion, their heavy armor becoming instruments of torture rather than protection. The very weapons that had made them masters of the battlefield now threatened to cook them alive. As chronicled in the historical accounts of the era, the Muslim forces had chosen their ground well, forcing the Christian army to fight without adequate water under the blazing sun. Through the haze of battle, Edmund could see Kingai's banner still flying, but the royal standard was surrounded by an ever-shrinking circle of loyal knights. The king himself, a man more suited to the political intrigues of court than the brutal realities of warfare, seemed overwhelmed by the catastrophe unfolding around him. Edmund Reginald's voice cut through the chaos. "The Templars are making one last charge. They're trying to break through to the springs." The white-mantled knights of the temple were indeed forming up for a final, desperate assault. Their grandmaster, Gerard de Reitford, raised his sword high, the blade catching the sunlight like a beacon of hope. These were men who had taken vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, but above all, they had sworn to defend the Holy Land with their lives. Now, as the kingdom crumbled around them, they prepared to honor that oath with their blood. The charge began in silence, save for the thunder of hooves on stone. 200 knights, the cream of Christian chivalry, launched themselves at the Muslim lines with the fury of men who had nothing left to lose. Their lances, each one a testament to European craftsmanship, formed a deadly hedge of steel points. For a moment it seemed as though faith and courage might triumph over overwhelming odds. But Saladin was no ordinary opponent. The Sultan had spent years studying Christian tactics, learning from defeats and victories alike. As the Templar charge struck his center, he gave the signal for his wings to close in. The trap that had been hours in the making finally snapped shut. The Christian knights, already exhausted and dehydrated, found themselves surrounded by enemies on all sides. Edmund watched in horror as the charge faltered, then broke. Knights who had seemed invincible in their steel shells were pulled from their horses by overwhelming numbers. The desert sand, already stained with blood, grew darker as the flower of Christian knighthood was cut down in the prime of life. The battle was becoming a massacre, and the defenders of the Holy Land were paying the ultimate price for their king's folly. The sun beat down mercilessly, and the twin peaks of Hattin bore witness to the end of an era. The afternoon sun reached its zenith, casting the battlefield in harsh relief, as Sir Edmund de Montfort fought with the desperate fury of a man who could see his world ending. His sword, once bright with holy blessing, now ran red with the blood of both friend and foe. The weight of his mail hauberk pressed down upon him like the judgment of God himself, each breath a struggle against the suffocating heat of the Holy Land. Around him, the remnants of the Christian army fought with the courage of the doomed. The true cross, that most sacred of relics, had fallen into Muslim hands despite the heroic efforts of its defenders. Archbishop Heraclius lay dead beside the golden frame, his ceremonial robe stained with dust and blood. The sight sent a chill through Edmund's heart that even the desert heat could not warm. My lord, a young squire, no more than 15 summers, stumbled toward him through the chaos. The boy's face was streaked with tears and grime, his voice cracking with exhaustion. "The king has been taken. Kingai is prisoner." The words hit Edmund like a physical blow. The capture of the king meant the end of organized resistance. Without royal authority, the feudal bonds that held the army together would dissolve like morning mist. Already he could see knights and sergeants throwing down their weapons, their faces marked with the hollow despair of defeat. Sir Reginald de Vere appeared at Edmund's side, his damaged arm bound with strips torn from his suit. "The Hospitaller Grand Master is dead," he reported grimly, "cut down trying to reach the springs. The Templars... Double quotes, he paused, his voice breaking. "God forgive us, but the Templars have been slaughtered almost to a man." Edmund felt something die inside him at those words. The military orders had been the backbone of the Crusader states for nearly a century, their warrior monks serving as both sword and shield for Christian pilgrims. Men like Gerard de Rydfort, the Templar Grand Master, had devoted their lives to the defense of the Holy Land. That such dedication could come to nothing seemed to mark the very foundations of their faith. Through the dust and smoke of battle, the distinctive yellow banners of Saladin's personal guard could be seen advancing steadily up the slopes of Hattin. The Sultan himself rode among them, his presence marked by the respectful way his soldiers parted before him. Even in victory, Saladin maintained the bearing of a true prince, his dark eyes surveying the battlefield with the detached assessment of a master strategist. The Muslim forces had fought with a coordination that spoke of years of preparation. Their mounted archers, skilled in the Parthian tactics of the East, had rained death upon the Christian ranks while remaining safely beyond the reach of heavy cavalry. When the knights charged, they found only air and arrows. When they tried to maintain formation, they were harassed from all sides by an enemy who appeared and vanished like desert mirage. "We need to reach the coast," Edmund said, his voice hoarse from shouting commands and breathing dust. "If we can make it to Tyre or Acre, we can regroup, send word to the west for reinforcements." Reginald shook his head sadly. "Look around you, my friend. We are the reinforcements. Every castle, every fortress in the kingdom has been stripped of its garrison for this battle. There is nothing left." The truth of those words was written in the faces of the survivors. These were not the confident crusaders who had marched out from Jerusalem with such high hopes. These were broken men, their faith shattered against the reality of superior numbers and tactics. The dream of a Christian kingdom in the Holy Land was bleeding out on the slopes of Hattin. A group of Muslim warriors approached under a flag of truce. Their leader, a tall man with the bearing of nobility, he spoke in heavily accented French, the language of the Crusader aristocracy. "By order of the Sultan, defender of the faith, all who surrender will be treated with mercy according to the laws of war." Edmund's hand tightened on his sword hilt. The blade was notched and stained, but it was still his grandfather's weapon, carried from the green fields of Normandy to the burning sands of Palestine. 3 generations of his family had wielded it in service to the cross. The thought of surrendering it to infidels made his very soul rebel. Yet around him, men were already laying down their arms. Knights who had seemed invincible in their steel shells removed their helmets, revealing faces marked by exhaustion and despair. Sergeants and crossbowmen followed suit, their weapons clattering to the ground like the dreams of a dying kingdom. "What are the prisoners?" Edmund asked, though he already feared the answer. The Muslim herald's expression grew grim. "Common soldiers and knights who fought with honor will be ransomed according to custom. But the Templars and he shrugged apologetically. "They have been declared enemies of the faith. The Sultan's mercy does not extend to them." The implications were clear. The warrior monks who had devoted their lives to the defense of the Holy Land would pay the ultimate price for their dedication. Men who had taken vows of poverty would find no gold to buy their freedom. Their only possessions were their weapons, their faith, and their lives. And 2 of these were already forfeit. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of blood and gold, Edmund de Montfort made his choice. Slowly, deliberately, he unbuckled his sword belt and let it fall to the rocky ground. The weapon that had been his constant companion for 20 years landed with a metallic ring that seemed to echo across the battlefield like the death knell of an empire. The Battle of Hattin was over. The Christian kingdom of Jerusalem lay in ruins, its army destroyed, its king captured, its sacred relics in enemy hands. But perhaps, Edmund thought as he raised his hands in surrender, this was not the end of the story. Perhaps it was merely the end of one chapter in a longer tale of faith and conflict that would echo through the ages. The twin peaks of Hattin had witnessed the death of dreams, but they had also seen the birth of legends that would inspire future generations of warriors to take up the cross once more. The crimson banner of Saladin fluttered above the captured Christian camp as the sun began its descent toward the Mediterranean horizon. So Edmund de Montfort knelt among the other prisoners, his hands bound behind his back with silken cord, a courtesy that spoke to the Sultan's adherence to the laws of war. The irony was not lost on him that he had been treated with more dignity in defeat than many Muslim prisoners had received in Christian victories. The Sultan himself sat beneath a pavilion of cloth of gold, his dark eyes surveying the remnants of the army that had once threatened his very existence. Saladin was not the barbarous infidel that Christian chroniclers had portrayed, but a man of evident nobility and learning. His Arabic was precise and eloquent, his bearing that of a born ruler. Even in victory he maintained the deportment of a prince who understood the weight of power. "Bring forward the king," Saladin commanded, his voice carrying Islia across the assembled prisoners. King de Lusignan was led forward, his royal surcoat torn and stained with dust and blood. The man who had ruled the kingdom of Jerusalem looked far older than his years, his face haggard with the realization of his catastrophic defeat. Behind Guy came Reginald de Chatillon, Lord of Carac, his silver hair matted with sweat and his proud bearing undiminished despite his bonds. This was the man whose raids against Muslim caravans had sparked the current conflict, whose castle of Carac had been a thorn in Saladin's side for decades. The Sultan's expression hardened as he gazed upon his old enemy. "What?" Guy gasped, his voice barely above a whisper. The desert heat had taken its toll on all the prisoners, but the king's suffering was evident in every line of his body. Without hesitation, Saladin gestured to one of his servants, who brought forward a goblet of cool water. The Sultan personally handed it to the Christian king, a gesture of mercy that drew murmurs of approval from the Muslim soldiers. Guy drank deeply, the precious liquid running down his chin in his haste. When he had finished, he offered the goblet to Reginald, but Saladin's hand shot out to stop him. "You gave him water," the Sultan said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of judgment. "I did not." The distinction was crucial under the laws of Arab hospitality. Once a host had offered food or drink to a guest, that person was under his protection. By preventing Reginald from drinking, Saladin had made clear that the Lord of Carac would receive no mercy. Edmund watched the scene unfold with growing dread. He had heard stories of Saladin's justice, his adherence to the principles of his faith even in the heat of battle, but he had also heard of the Sultan's anger against those who violated the codes of war. Reginald de Chatillon had broken truces, attacked pilgrims, and shown no mercy to Muslim prisoners. Now, it seemed, he would face the consequences of his actions. "Do you remember?" Saladin said, rising from his seat and approaching the bound lord. "When you said that your sword would remain forever stained with Muslim blood, when you swore that no caravan would pass safely through your lands." Reginald's chin lifted defiantly. "I remember. I regret nothing. I have served Christ and his kingdom as my conscience demanded." The Sultan's sword whispered from its scabbard, the curved blade catching the light of the setting sun. "Then let Allah judge between us." The stroke was swift and clean, ending the life of one of the most feared and hated men in the Christian East. Reginald's head rolled in the dust, his silver hair stained with blood. King Guy cried out and fell backward, certain that his own death was imminent. But Saladin cleaned his blade and sheathed it, then knelt beside the terrified monarch. "A king does not kill a king," he said gently. "You are safe, Guy of Lus. Your ransom will be arranged and you will return to your people." The mercy shown to Guy stood in stark contrast to the fate awaiting the captured members of the military orders. The Templars and Hospitallers were being separated from the other prisoners, their white and black mantles marking them for death. These men had taken vows that made them perpetual enemies of Islam, their very existence a challenge to Muslim rule in the Holy Land. "You fought bravely," Saladin said, addressing the assembled prisoners. "Your courage honors your faith, even as your cause was doomed. Those who can be ransomed will be treated according to the customs of war. Those who cannot." He gestured toward the warrior monks, his meaning clear. Edmund felt his heart sink as he watched men he had known for years being led away to their deaths. Brother Marcus Argentus Sol, who had tended the sick in the hospital of St. John, Sir Geoffrey de, who had saved Edmund's life at the siege of Ash. These were not the bloodthirsty fanatics of Muslim propaganda, but devoted men who had given their lives to serve others. Yet, even as he mourned their fate, Edmund could not deny the justice of it. How many Muslim prisoners had met similar ends in Christian dungeons? How many villages had been put to the sword by crusading armies drunk on victory and religious fervor? The wheel of fortune had turned, and those who had lived by the sword were dying by it. As recorded in the chronicles of the time, Saladin's treatment of his prisoners would become legendary throughout both Christian and Muslim lands. The Sultan's adherence to the laws of war, his mercy toward those who had shown mercy, and his justice toward those who had not, would be remembered long after the dust of Hattin had settled. The last rays of sunlight painted the battlefield in shades of gold and crimson as the great sorting began. Some prisoners would see their homelands again, their ransoms paid by grateful families. Others would spend years in captivity, their freedom contingent on the political necessities of their captors. And some, the most dedicated warriors of the faith, would find their earthly service ending on the slopes of Hattin. Edmund de Montfort watched it all with the detached fascination of a man who had seen his world collapse in a single day. The kingdom of Jerusalem was finished, its army destroyed, its leadership captured or dead. Yet somehow, he sensed that this was not the end of the story, but merely the beginning of a new chapter in the eternal struggle between cross and crescent. The twin peaks of Hattin had witnessed the death of one dream, but they had also seen the birth of another. For in the ashes of defeat, the seeds of the Third Crusade were already being sown. News of the catastrophe at Hattin spread across the Christian world like wildfire, carried by survivors who had escaped the slaughter and refugees fleeing the Muslim region. In the courts of Europe, the disastrous defeat sent shockwaves through the very foundations of Christendom. The Holy Land, won at such terrible cost during the First Crusade, was slipping away like sand through desperate fingers. Sir Edmund de Montfort found himself in the great hall of King Henry II of England, the autumn rain lashing against the windows of the palace at Winchester. 3 years had passed since his ransom had been paid. 3 years of sleepless nights haunted by the memory of Hatton and the faces of comrades who would never return home. His hair, once golden as wheat, was now streaked with premature silver, and his eyes held the hollow look of a man who had seen too much. "Tell me again of the battle," commanded a voice that could silence a room with its authority. Richard Plantagenet, Duke of Aquitaine and heir to the English throne, stood before a great map of the Holy Land, his finger tracing the roads that led to Jerusalem. At 29 he was already renowned as one of the finest military minds in Europe, his campaigns in Aquitaine having forged him into a weapon of war. "The heat was our enemy as much as the Saracens," Edmund replied, his voice still rough from the desert winds that had scoured his throat 3 years before. "Our armor became furnaces, our water ran out, and Saladin chose his ground well. We were trapped between his army and the Twin Peaks, with no escape." Richard's pale blue eyes, cold as winter frost, fixed on Edmund with the intensity that had made him legendary. "And the true cross, how did it fall into infidel hands?" The question still cut like a blade. Edmund's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "Archbishop Heraclius died defending it. The Bishop of Acre fell beside him. They held the center until the very end, but there were simply too many enemies. When the last defenders were overwhelmed, the Sultan's men claimed it as a prize of war." The assembled nobles shifted uncomfortably. The loss of the true cross was more than a military disaster. It was a spiritual catastrophe that struck at the very heart of Christian faith. The relic that had led the First Crusade to victory was now in the hands of those they considered infidels. A symbol of humiliation that demanded answer. "How many survived?" asked Philip Augustus, King of France, his dark eyes reflecting the same hunger for revenge that burned in every Christian heart. The French monarch was younger than Richard but no less ambitious, his calculating mind already working through the logistics of a new crusade. "Perhaps 1 in 10, Edmund answered truthfully. The military orders were virtually destroyed. The Templars and Hospitallers who survived the battle were executed by Saladin's order. The kingdom's defensive network collapsed overnight, as chronicled in the contemporary accounts of the period. The destruction of the Crusader army at Hattin represented the most catastrophic defeat in the history of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. The loss of military manpower, combined with the capture of the True Cross, had left the Christian settlements virtually defenseless against Muslim recruits. Frederick Barbarossa, Holy Roman Emperor, struck the table with his mailed fist. "This cannot stand. The Holy Sepulchre itself is threatened. If Jerusalem falls, the very foundations of our faith will be shaken." The German emperor, despite his advanced years, still possessed a fire that had made him the terror of his enemies for decades. "Jerusalem has already fallen," Edmund said quietly. "Saladin took the city 2 months after Hattin. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre is in Muslim hands, though the Sultan has promised to allow Christian pilgrims to visit." The silence that followed was deafening. The loss of Jerusalem, the city of David, the site of Christ's crucifixion and resurrection, was a blow that struck at the very soul of medieval Christianity. For nearly a century, the Holy City had been the jewel in the crown of the Crusader states, its recovery, the fulfillment of Pope Urban's great vision. "Then we must take it back," Richard said simply, his voice carrying the absolute certainty of a man who had never known defeat. "We must gather the armies of Christendom and return to the Holy Land. We must wash away the stain of Hattin with infidel blood." The words sent a thrill through the assembled nobles. Here was the leader they had been waiting for, the man who could unite the fractured kingdoms of Europe in a common cause. Richard's reputation as a warrior was already legendary. His victories in Aquitaine proof of his military genius. If anyone could succeed where Guy de Lusignan had failed, it was the man they were already calling the Lionheart. "I will take the cross," Philip Augustus declared, his voice ringing with conviction. "France will not stand idle while the Holy Land remains in infidel hands." "As will I," added Frederick Barbarossa, his aged face set in lines of iron determination. "The Empire will march again to Jerusalem, as it did in the days of my predecessor Conrad." Edmund felt his heart stir with something he had not experienced since the disaster at Hattin. These were not the divided, quarreling barons who had followed Guy de Lusignan to destruction. These were the 3 most powerful rulers in Europe, united in their determination to restore Christian rule to the Holy Land. With such leadership, perhaps the disaster of Hattin could be redeemed. "What of Saladin?" asked Richard, his tactical mind already working through the challenges they would face. "What manner of man is he? What are his strengths and weaknesses?" Edmund considered the question carefully. "He is not the barbarian our chroniclers portray. He is a man of honor, learned in the arts of war and diplomacy. His greatest strength is his ability to unite the Muslim world under his banner. His greatest weakness," he paused, remembering the Sultan's courtesy even in victory, "perhaps his very nobility. He observes the laws of war, even when his enemies do not." "Then we must be prepared to face a worthy opponent," Richard said with what might have been satisfaction. "The greater the challenge, the greater the glory in victory." As the council continued late into the night, plans began to take shape for what would become known as the Third Crusade. 3 kings would lead their armies to the Holy Land, each bringing the military might of their kingdoms to bear against the forces of Islam. The disaster at Hattin would be avenged, Jerusalem would be reclaimed, and the true cross would be restored to Christian hands. Edmund de Montfort, survivor of one of the greatest military disasters in medieval history, found himself appointed as advisor to the new crusade. His knowledge of the Holy Land, his understanding of Muslim tactics, and his hard-won wisdom would help guide the warriors of Christendom in their quest for redemption. The Twin Peaks of Hattin had witnessed the death of one dream, but from its ashes, another was rising. The greatest crusade in history was about to begin. The Mediterranean sun blazed down upon the walls of Acre as the combined armies of Christendom gathered for the siege that would determine the fate of the Holy Land. Sir Edmund de Montfort stood upon the ramparts of the Crusader camp, his weathered face squinting against the glare as he surveyed the massive fortifications that had defied Christian assault for nearly 2 years. The port city, with its massive towers and double walls, had become the symbol of Muslim resistance in the wake of Hattin. "The city is stronger than Jerusalem ever was," observed Sir Geoffrey de Lusignan, brother to the captured king. His voice carried the bitter wisdom of a man who had seen too many sieges fail against seemingly impossible odds. "Saladin has had time to strengthen the defenses, and his garrison is well supplied from the sea." Edmund nodded grimly. The siege of Acre had begun in 1189, initiated by Guy de Lusignan after his release from captivity. For 2 years, the Christian forces had maintained their grip on the landward approaches to the city, but the Muslim fleet still controlled the harbor. Supplies flowed freely to the defenders while the besiegers struggled with disease, hunger, and the constant threat of Saladin's relief army. The arrival of the Third Crusade had changed everything. Richard Plantagenet, now King of England following his father's death, had reached the Holy Land with a reputation that preceded him like thunder before lightning. His victories in Sicily and Cyprus had proven that the lessons of Hattin had been learned and absorbed. This was not the divided, quarreling host that had followed Guy de Lusignan to disaster. This was a professional army led by one of the finest military minds in Europe. "There, do you see?" Geoffrey pointed toward the harbor where the distinctive shape of English galleys could be seen maneuvering against the Muslim fleet. "The Lionheart has brought his ships around. If he can break the blockade, the city will fall within days." The naval battle that followed was a masterpiece of medieval warfare. Richard's ships, equipped with the latest innovations in siege warfare, closed with the Muslim galleys in a display of tactical brilliance that left even hardened veterans speechless. Greek fire arced across the water in deadly streams, while massive catapults mounted on the largest vessels hurled stone projectiles at the harbor fortifications. Edmund watched as the English king's banner, the 3 golden lions of England on a field of red, moved steadily closer to the harbor mouth. Richard himself could be seen on the prow of his flagship, his golden hair streaming in the wind, his sword raised in salute to his followers. This was the moment that would define the Third Crusade, the test of whether Christian arms could overcome the legacy of Hattin. "God wills it." The ancient battle cry of the Crusades echoed across the water as the English fleet smashed through the Muslim naval defenses. Ships grappled together in deadly embrace, their crews fighting with the desperate fury of men who knew that defeat meant death or slavery. The harbor ran red with blood as the 2 fleets tore each other apart in the narrow confines of the port. But Richard's tactical genius began to tell. His ships, purpose-built for this campaign, possessed advantages that the Muslim fleet could not match. Their higher sides gave his archers commanding fields of fire, while their reinforced rams could punch through enemy hulls with devastating effect. One by one, the Muslim vessels were sunk or captured, their crews either killed or driven ashore. "The harbor is ours," Geoffrey shouted, his voice cracking with emotion. "By all the saints, the harbor is ours." The fall of Acre's naval defenses marked the beginning of the end for the city's garrison. Cut off from resupply and facing assault from both land and sea, the defenders found themselves in an impossible position. Saladin's relief army, though numerous, could not overcome the combined might of the Crusader host, now that supplies were flowing freely through the captured harbor. As recorded in the contemporary chronicle of Geoffrey de Vinsauf, Richard's chaplain, the siege of Acre became the first major Christian victory.